July, 1885. The Mojave Desert. 110 degrees of merciless heat, and not a soul for miles. A lone cowboy is riding north, minding his own business, when suddenly a scream tears through the silence. A woman, alone, in the middle of nowhere, about to give birth. He could have kept riding. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem. But something inside him refused to let him go. What happened in the next few hours didn't just save 2 lives. It completely destroyed the walls around one man's heart and built something neither of them ever saw coming. This story is proof that your entire life can change in the moment you choose to stop. Not for someone you know, not for someone who can repay you, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Here on this channel, we bring you stories straight from the soul of the Old West, tales of rugged cowboys and the tender hearts beating beneath those dusty hats, of love that blooms in the most impossible places, of mothers who fight with everything they have, and strangers who become family. Because out on the frontier, what made people truly strong was never just their grit. It was their compassion. If this story touched your heart, show it some love with a like. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience.
That scream just about tore the desert quiet in half. Wade Emerson yanked the reins so hard his horse skidded to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air. It was July of 1885, and the Mojave Desert did not play favorites. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, and Wade had been pushing for 3 long days out of Skidoo, California. He was hauling supplies to a mining camp, still a day's ride north. At 26 years old, he looked older, with a life of hard work etched into his face, but that sound made his blood run cold. It was the sound of a woman in terrible, terrible pain. Have you ever felt that helpless, hearing someone suffer, and knowing you are the only one around? That is a feeling that tests a man, shows him what he is truly made of. He nudged his buckskin mare forward, his eyes scanning the trail. The path twisted through rock formations that stuck up from the desert floor like a mouthful of broken teeth. Somewhere in that mess of stone and shadow, someone was in deep trouble. Another cry, sharper this time, pointed the way. He spurred his horse into a run, the supply bags bouncing hard against its flanks. He found her crumpled up next to a creosote bush, the only patch of shade for miles, and it was barely big enough to cover her. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark red hair stuck to her sweaty face. Her dress was soaked, and when she looked up at him, her green eyes were a battleground of pure fear and stubborn grit. "Please," she choked out before another wave of pain grabbed hold of her and stole her words. Wade was on the ground in an instant, his mind scrambling for a plan and coming up empty. He had helped birth a calf or 2 in his time, but a human being was a whole other story. And this woman was all by herself, with no wagon, no horse, just a small bundle of belongings lying a few feet away. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm as he knelt beside her. "Hours," she said between ragged breaths. "My husband, he was taking me to my sister's place in Barstow. Our wagon threw a wheel yesterday. He went to get help, told me to stay put. But the baby didn't want to wait." Her voice cracked on that last part. Tears cut clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "He should have been back by now. I know something happened to him. I just know it. I couldn't just sit there waiting, so I started walking. But the pains got too strong, and I couldn't go on." Wade scanned the empty horizon, a vast ocean of sand and rock in every direction. Skidoo was a full day's hard ride back the way he came. Barstow was 2 days ahead. There was no help coming, no doctor, no one but him, this frightened woman, and a baby who was on its way, ready or not. "What's your name?" he asked, already untying his bedroll from his saddle. Rebecca Garrett." Another contraction hit, and she grabbed his arm, her grip so tight he felt it in his bones. "Please, don't you leave me here." "I'm not leaving you anywhere," Wade said, his voice firm. He spread his bedroll on the ground, giving her a cleaner place to lie than the dirt. "My name is Wade Emerson, and I'm going to help you get through this. Do you understand me, Rebecca? You are not alone anymore." She gave a small nod, and a little of the wild panic in her eyes seemed to settle, though she was still breathing fast and hard. Wade brought his canteen over and helped her take a drink. The water was as warm as bath water, but she drank it down like it was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. "All right, we need to get you onto this bedroll," Wade said, moving to help her. "Think you can move?" Rebecca nodded, and he gently helped her shift from the hard ground to the softer blanket. The effort brought on another contraction, this one stronger than the last. She cried out and latched onto his shirt with both hands. He held her steady, murmuring quiet, reassuring words, though his own heart was pounding like a drum. When the pain passed, she fell back, completely worn out. Her dress was a mess, and Wade tried not to look too closely. He had no idea what he was doing, no training at all, only a gut feeling to go on. He remembered hearing that folks had been having babies for thousands of years without any doctors around. People were tough. They survived. He figured if they could do it, then maybe, just maybe, they could too. Even out here, with nothing but a cowboy's will to see it through. "How far apart are the pains?" Wade asked, trying to recall any bit of wisdom he had ever overheard. "Close," Rebecca gasped. "They're so close now. I think it's time." Wade swallowed, the lump in his throat feeling as big as a rock, and nodded. He went to his saddlebag and pulled out his only spare shirt. It was clean, and it would have to do for wrapping up the newborn. He also took out his knife. He poured a little whiskey from his flask over the blade, remembering someone telling him that keeping things clean was important. The next wave of pain hit before he was ready, and Rebecca's scream bounced off the rocks. Wade rushed back to her side. She seized his hand, squeezing with a strength that felt like it could shatter bone. He just let her hold on, giving her something solid to fight against. "You're doing great," Wade said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not expect. "You're strong, Rebecca. You're stronger than you know." "I'm scared," she whispered when she could finally speak. "I don't want to die out here. I don't want my baby to die." "You are not going to die," Wade said with a lot more confidence than he actually felt. "And neither is your baby. I promise you that." He did not have a clue if he could keep that promise, but she needed to hear it. And Lord help him, he needed to believe it too. The contractions started coming one right after the other, with almost no time to breathe in between. Rebecca was crying and pushing, her face flushed with the effort. Wade moved into position, his stomach churning with a mix of fear and sheer wonder. "I can see the head," he said, his voice trembling just a little. "Rebecca, the baby is coming. When that next pain comes, you need to push with everything you've got." She could only nod, all her energy focused. And when the contraction came, she bore down with a strength he did not think was possible. Wade guided the baby's head as it came into the world, impossibly tiny and slick. He had never witnessed anything like it, never felt the weight of a new life in his hands. "Again," he urged. "One more big push." Rebecca let out a raw cry of effort, and with a final push, the baby's shoulders came free. Wade caught the infant, a warm, slippery bundle that felt both delicate and like a miracle. The baby took a breath and let out a tiny, reedy cry that was the most beautiful sound Wade had ever heard. Tears welled up in his eyes as he gently wiped the little one's face. "It's a boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a son, Rebecca." She was crying too, reaching out with trembling hands. Wade helped lay the baby on her chest. Mother and son looked at each other for the very first time. Wade worked carefully with his clean knife to tie and cut the umbilical cord, trying his best not to think about everything that could have gone wrong. But the baby was breathing. Rebecca was breathing. And right then, that was all that mattered in the whole wide world. Wade wrapped his spare shirt around the little boy to keep him warm and helped Rebecca get more comfortable. He gave her more water, watching her cradle her son. A look of pure wonder and exhaustion was on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes full of a gratitude so deep it left him speechless. "You saved our lives." "You did all the hard work," Wade said, sitting back on his heels and wiping the sweat from his own brow. His hands were shaking now that it was all over, the adrenaline draining out of him and leaving him feeling strangely empty. They stayed there in that little patch of shade as the sun started to dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Wade kept watch, his rifle resting on his lap. Rebecca and the baby slept, and Wade watched them. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, a feeling he did not recognize. He had been a loner for so long, ever since his folks died of a fever when he was just 18. He had drifted from one place to the next, never putting down roots, never letting anyone get too close. It was just easier that way. But as he looked at Rebecca and her new son, he felt something shift deep inside him, like a door he had kept locked for years had just cracked open. When Rebecca finally stirred, the shadows were long and the worst of the day's heat had passed. She looked around, confused for a second, and then her eyes fell on the baby sleeping in her arms. A wave of pure relief washed over her face. She had been worried it was all just a dream, or even worse, that they hadn't made it through after all. Wade asked her softly, "How are you feeling?" She had to admit, she was tired and sore, but she was alive. She took a breath, then looked right at him. "My husband. He really ought to have been back by now." Wade gave a slow nod. He'd been thinking the very same thing. A fella doesn't just leave his pregnant wife by herself in the desert unless he's got no other choice. And if he'd gone to get help, he should have been back a long time ago. That could only mean something had gone terribly wrong, and Wade didn't want to say those words out loud, not with Rebecca looking so frail and worn out. "We need to get you to a safe place," Wade said instead. "Are you able to travel?" Rebecca glanced down at her baby and then back up at Wade. "I do not reckon I have much of a choice." Wade nodded and got to his feet, walking over to his horse. The buckskin mare was a good, patient animal, standing right where he had left her, even after all those hours. He took off some of his supplies, moving the weight around to clear a space for Rebecca and the baby. It meant he would have to leave behind some of the goods he was getting paid to haul, but that felt mighty small compared to the lives hanging in the balance. He rigged up a sling from his bedroll, making a carrier Rebecca could wear to hold the baby close to her chest and keep her hands free. Getting her up on that horse was the next big task. She was weak from giving birth, her legs all shaky and unsure. But Wade took her weight and lifted her up as gently as he knew how into the saddle. "Hold on to the horn," he told her, and he adjusted the stirrups so her feet could rest easy. "I am going to lead the horse. We will go nice and slow." Rebecca nodded. She had one arm wrapped around the baby in the sling, and her other hand was gripping the saddle horn tight. Wade took the reins and started walking south, heading back toward Skidoo. At this pace, it would take them 2 days, maybe even longer, but it was the closest town. Rebecca needed real care, some food, a good rest, and a safe roof over her head. They walked on through the evening and deep into the night. Wade used the stars and the pale glow of a sliver of moon to guide them. Rebecca dozed off in the saddle, and the gentle rocking of the horse seemed to keep the baby calm and quiet. Wade just kept on walking, his legs aching and his eyes stinging from being so tired, but he never stopped. Every single mile he put between them and that empty stretch of desert felt like a small victory. When the sun started to break, painting the desert pink and gold, Wade finally decided it was time to stop. Rebecca needed a real rest, and the baby needed to nurse. Wade helped her down from the horse and spread out his last blanket for her to sit on. He built a small fire and made some coffee with the supplies he still had. It was strong and bitter, but it was hot, and Rebecca took the cup from him with gratitude. "Tell me about your husband," Wade said. It wasn't that he was particularly curious, but Rebecca looked like she needed to talk. She needed to give a voice to the fear that had been building up in her eyes with every hour that passed. His name was Thomas, Rebecca said in a low voice, staring down into her coffee cup. We met in Sacramento 2 years ago. He was a good man, steady and kind. When I found out I was expecting, he wanted to bring me somewhere safer than the mining camps we'd been living in. My sister, she married a rancher near Barstow, and Thomas figured I could stay with her until the baby arrived. She stopped for a moment, her voice catching in her throat. We were so close. Just another day, maybe two, and then the wagon wheel broke and everything just fell to pieces. Wade heard how she used the word was to describe Thomas, and he knew she had already accepted the thing she couldn't bring herself to say out loud. If Thomas was coming back, he would have found them by now. Something had happened to him out there in that desert, something that had left his wife and his unborn child stranded all alone. I am sorry, Wade said, and he truly meant it. Rebecca nodded, and tears started sliding down her cheeks. She looked down at the baby sleeping in her arms, and her whole face changed from grief to a look of fierce determination. I have to keep going for him. Whatever happened to Thomas, I cannot change it, but I can make sure his son makes it. Wade felt that same strange feeling in his own chest again. That door he kept locked tight was opening up a little wider. Rebecca had a kind of strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the person she was deep down. She had given birth all by herself in the desert, had stared death in the face with courage, and now she was ready to keep pushing forward, no matter her loss and her pain. What are you going to name him? Wade asked, nodding toward the baby. Rebecca was quiet for a second, thinking it over. James, she said at last, after Thomas's father, James Thomas Garrett. Wade nodded. That was a good name, solid and strong. He watched as Rebecca nursed the baby, then turned his eyes away to give her some privacy. But he kept a close watch on the desert all around them. They were in a bad spot here, out in the open and tired. But nothing bothered them besides the wind and the cry of a hawk flying high above. They rested for a couple of hours, taking turns sleeping while the other one kept an eye out. When the worst of the midday heat had finally passed, they started moving again. Rebecca seemed a little stronger, though Wade could see the pain in every move she made. Childbirth was a hard business, even in the best of places, and Rebecca had gone through it with nothing but the bare ground and the help of a stranger. That night they made camp again, and Wade cooked up a simple supper of beans and dried meat over the fire. Rebecca ate like she was starving. Her body was crying out for fuel to recover from everything it had been through. The baby, James, seemed healthy and strong. He cried when he was hungry and slept peacefully against his mother's chest the rest of the time. Why were you out here? Rebecca asked as they sat by the fire, so far from any town. Just running supplies between Skidoo and the mining camps up north, Wade explained. I have been doing it for about a year now. The work is steady, and I do not mind being alone. You have family in Skidoo? Rebecca asked. Wade shook his head. No family anywhere. My parents passed on 8 years ago. I have been on my own since then. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the firelight. That must get lonely. Wade just shrugged, not feeling comfortable with the sympathy he heard in her voice. I am used to it. That does not mean it is not lonely, Rebecca said softly. Wade didn't have an answer for that, so he stood up and went to check on the horse. It gave him something to do with his hands and a good reason to look away from Rebecca's knowing eyes. She saw too much, understood too much, and it made him feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the wide-open desert surrounding them. They finally reached the edge of Skidoo late the next afternoon. The town was small, not much more than a handful of buildings huddled around the mining operation that kept it alive. It had only popped up a few years back when folks discovered gold in the area, and most of the people there were rough men trying to find their fortune in this unforgiving land. But it had a doctor, a general store, and a boarding house run by a woman named Martha Chen. She was known for taking in strays and not asking too many questions. Wade led them straight to Martha's place, which was a solid adobe building on the edge of town. Martha herself answered his knock. She was a short, sturdy woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and sharp eyes that took in the whole situation in a single glance. "Wade Emerson," she said. Her accent was a mix of her Cantonese roots and many years of speaking English. "You bring me interesting things this time." "This is Rebecca Garrett," Wade said. "She needs a place to rest and get her strength back. She gave birth 2 days ago out on the desert trail. I found her all alone." Martha's expression went from curious to concerned in a heartbeat. She opened the door wider and waved them inside. "Bring her in quickly now. You did what for her?" She aimed that last question at Wade as he helped Rebecca down from the horse. "I caught the baby," Wade said, plain and simple. Martha's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't ask any more questions. She just led them to a room at the back of the boarding house. It was small, but it was clean. It had a real bed with clean sheets and a window that let in the light and air. Wade helped Rebecca sit on the edge of the bed, and Martha immediately started fussing over her, checking her temperature and looking over the baby with a skill that showed she'd done this before. "You did good work," Martha said to Wade after a few minutes. "Mama and baby are both healthy, all things considered. But she needs rest, good food, and time to heal." She then turned to Rebecca. "You stay here as long as you need to. No charge for the first week. After that, we can talk." "I can pay," Rebecca said right away. "I have some money in my pack." Martha just waved her hand like it was nothing. "We will worry about that later. Right now, you rest." Wade started to back away toward the door, suddenly feeling like he didn't belong in this room that was now full of womanly business. But Rebecca called out his name, stopping him. "Will you come back?" she asked, and there was a vulnerable sound in her voice that made his chest ache. "To check on us?" "Yes," Wade said, without even thinking about it, without asking himself why the answer came out so easy. "I will come back." He left them there and went to put his horse in the stable, then walked to the small room he rented above the general store. It wasn't much, just a bed, a chair, and a trunk for his things. But it was more than enough. He'd never given a second thought to his simple life, but now it felt as hollow as a dried-out gourd. Wade washed up and put on clean clothes, then headed to the saloon for a shot of whiskey and a hot plate of food. The liquor burned all the way down, but it couldn't wash out the feeling of Rebecca's hand holding his, or the weight of that new baby boy settling into his palms, or the sound of his first cry cutting through the quiet desert air. He found himself walking back to Martha's boarding house the next morning, just telling himself he was checking on them, the same way he would a hurt animal or a sick friend. But when Rebecca smiled at him from the bed, propped up on pillows with the baby sleeping in a basket right next to her, Wade felt another wall inside him crumble to dust. "How you feeling?" he asked, standing there in the doorway like he did not know what to do with his hands. "Better," Rebecca said. "Martha brought me some food and helped me get cleaned up. It feels like a miracle just to sleep in a real bed again." Her smile faltered just a bit. "Have you heard anything? About a wagon on the trail, or anyone looking for a man who's gone missing?" Wade slowly shook his head. He had asked around town the night before, quiet-like, but nobody had seen a broken-down wagon or a man asking for help. The desert held its secrets close, and whatever became of Thomas Garrett was one of them. "I'm real sorry," Wade said again. Rebecca nodded, her gaze fixed on something far away. "I think I knew it, even before you said so. I just felt that he was gone." "Is that strange?" "No," Wade said. "I don't think that's strange at all." He visited them every day for the next week, bringing little things when he could. He brought a rattle for the baby that he had whittled from a piece of scrap wood. He brought fresh fruit from the general store for Rebecca. Every time he came, he stayed a little longer, and their talks got easier, going deeper than just polite chatter. Rebecca told him about growing up back in Missouri, about following her folks out west after her daddy heard stories about gold and opportunity out in California. She talked about meeting Thomas and the simple life they had made together, a life that was modest but full of happiness. Wade found himself talking right back, saying things he had not said out loud in years. He told her about his parents and the farm they used to have, and the fever that took them both in the same week. He spoke of the long years of drifting that came after, never putting down roots, never letting another soul get close enough to matter. "Why not?" Rebecca asked one afternoon, nursing little James with a blanket draped over her shoulder. "Why keep everyone so far away?" Wade stayed quiet for a long moment, just staring out the window at the dusty street. "Because folks always leave, one way or another," he said at last. "It just seemed a whole lot easier not to give 'em a reason to stay in the first place." "That ain't living," Rebecca said, her voice soft as a whisper. "That's just getting by, and those two things are not the same." Wade didn't have a thing to say to that, mostly because he had a sinking feeling she was right. He had been just getting by for 8 long years, moving from one town to the next like a ghost, never touching anything long enough to leave his mark, or let it leave a mark on him. It had felt safe. But sitting in this little room with Rebecca and baby James, he started to wonder what he had truly been protecting himself from, and if it had been worth the price he paid. Martha came in right then with a tray of food, breaking the quiet moment, and Wade got up to go. But as he got to the door, Rebecca called out his name. "Thank you," she said, her green eyes looking right into him. "For everything. For finding me, for helping me, for keeping on coming back. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have found a way," Wade told her. "You're a whole lot stronger than you think." But as he walked away, he knew that was only half the truth. Rebecca was strong, no doubt about it, but everybody needs a hand sometimes. Everybody needs someone to reach out in the dark and pull them back into the light. He had done that for her. And in some strange way, she had done the very same thing for him, though he was only just beginning to understand it. The days bled into weeks, and Wade's life found a new kind of rhythm. He still hauled supplies when the work was there. But he started finding more reasons to stay in Skidoo, to check on Rebecca and James, to help Martha fix things around the boarding house, to just be still in one place in a way he had not been for a very long time. Rebecca got her strength back, the color returning to her face, her steps growing more steady. James was getting bigger, plump and healthy from his mother's milk. His little eyes started to follow things, and his tiny hands would wave at anything that got close. Wade found himself watching the baby, amazed at how he changed from one day to the next. One evening, Martha pulled Wade aside in the hallway just outside Rebecca's room. "You know folks are talking," she said, straight to the point. "About what?" Wade asked, though he had a pretty good idea. "About you and Rebecca, about all the time you're spending here, about what's going to happen when she's well enough to leave this place." Wade felt his jaw clench. "We're just friends." Martha gave him a look that said she had heard that old story before and was not buying it. "She's a widow with a brand new baby, and not a penny to her name. You're a single man with no one to answer to and a whole lot of interest, it seems. I'm not passing judgment, Wade, but I'm telling you to be sure about what you're doing. That woman's been through the ringer. She doesn't need any more heartache." Wade wanted to argue that he had no intention of causing Rebecca any pain, but Martha had already turned and walked off, leaving him there in the hall with his thoughts all tangled up. He did not know what he was doing, if he was being honest with himself. All he knew was that he could not stay away, that any day he did not see Rebecca and James felt wrong, like a piece of him was missing. He went in to see them anyway, just like he'd planned, and found Rebecca sitting in the rocking chair by the window with James asleep in her arms. She looked up as he came in, and her smile lit a fire right in the middle of his chest. "I was hoping you'd come by tonight," she said. "I needed to talk to you about something." Wade sat down in the chair across from her, feeling a sudden nervousness. "What is it?" "Martha says I'm well enough to travel soon," Rebecca said. "And I've been thinking on what to do. I can't go to my sister in Barstow, not by myself with a new baby. It's not safe. And I can't stay here forever living off Martha's kindness." "You could stay," Wade heard himself say, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Here in Skidoo, I mean. Find some work, make a life." Rebecca was quiet for a second, studying his face with those sharp green eyes. "Is that what you want, Wade? For me to stay?" Wade had to swallow hard. This was it, he knew. This was the moment he either stepped into something new and frightening, or took a step back into the lonely safety he'd known for so long. Martha's words rang in his ears, that warning to be sure of what he was doing. But when he looked at Rebecca, at the hope and the worry mixed together on her face, he knew there was only one thing he could say. "Yes," he said, his voice sounding rough. "I want you to stay." "Why?" Rebecca asked. She was not doubting him, just asking, needing to know. Wade got up and walked to the window, looking out at the sky as it turned dark. "Because when I'm with you, I feel like I'm living, instead of just getting by. Because I care more about what happens to you and James than I've cared about anything in years. Because the idea of you leaving makes me see just how empty my life has been without me even knowing it." He turned back to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Rebecca, and I don't have the first clue what to do about it." Rebecca's eyes went wide, and she did not say a word for what felt like forever. Panic started to rise up in Wade. A cold fear that he'd said way too much, moved way too fast, and wrecked the fragile friendship they had built. But then Rebecca stood up, careful not to wake James, and walked right over to him. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And it scares me half to death, because Thomas has only been gone a month, and I feel so guilty for feeling this way. But I can't stop it. Wade, you saved my life. You saved James's life. And you kept coming back day after day. I find myself watching the road for you, hoping you'll come, feeling let down when you have to go." Wade reached out and gently touched her face, his rough fingers trembling just a little. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. We can take our time with this." "I'd like that," Rebecca said, leaning her cheek into his hand. "But I need you to know that I'm sure about you, about this. I know it's fast. I know people will talk, but I am sure." Wade felt something tight inside his chest, finally let go, a knot he had been carrying for years just unraveling. He leaned down and kissed her on the forehead, a soft and gentle kiss that was a promise for what would come later, when the time was right. "Stay in Skidoo," he said. "Let me help you get settled, find a place of your own, help you with James. Let me court you the right way, the way you deserve." Rebecca smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." They just stood there together as the first stars started to pop out in the night sky, James sleeping soundly between them, and Wade felt like he was finally home after 8 long years of wandering. The next few months flew by in a whirlwind of change. Martha had a small cottage behind her, boarding house she had been using for storage, and Wade put in several long weeks getting it back into shape, making it a proper home for Rebecca and James. He patched up the roof, put new glass in the broken windows, built them some furniture, and gave the walls a fresh coat of paint. Rebecca pitched in whenever she could, and working side by side, they turned that forgotten old building into a warm little spot they could call their own. Wade was real careful about courting Rebecca the right way, always keeping in mind what she had just been through and her standing in a town this small. He would bring her wildflowers he picked from the side of the trail, take her for strolls through Skidoo when James was sleeping soundly in the sling she wore, and sit with her on the porch in the evenings, just talking about anything and everything that came to mind. They talked about their hopes and their worries, about old heartbreaks and their dreams for what was to come, slowly building up a solid trust and understanding between them. The folks in Skidoo watched it all happen, but with a lot less judgment than Wade had braced himself for. Martha had told everyone the story of how Wade found Rebecca and delivered her baby out on that desert trail. And with each telling, the tale started to sound almost like a local legend. People looked at them as two survivors who had found one another in the toughest of times, and most everyone was willing to give them a fair shake. Little James grew bigger and stronger, and his own little personality started to show through. He was a happy baby, always ready with a smile and rarely one to fuss, And Wade found himself absolutely taken with the little fella. He had never given much thought to children before, figuring that part of life just was not in the cards for him, but holding James in his arms and watching him take in the world filled Wade with a kind of joy he never knew existed. One evening in early October, when the desert heat was finally letting up and turning into something a man could stand, Wade and Rebecca sat on the porch of her little cottage. They watched the sunset paint the whole sky in shades of orange and deep purple. James was asleep inside, giving them a rare moment of quiet all to themselves. "I have been doing some thinking," Wade said, his voice quiet and a little shaky, which was not like him at all. "About what?" Rebecca asked, though the look on her face said she might have already guessed. "About the future. About how I want my life to be." Wade took her hand in his thumb gently stroking across her knuckles. "I know we agreed to take things slow, and the last thing I want to do is rush you into something you are not ready for. But Rebecca, I just cannot picture a life without you and James in it anymore. These last few months have been the very best of my whole life." Rebecca's eyes were glistening when she looked up at him. "They have been happy for me too, Wade. It has been complicated and hard sometimes because I am still grieving Thomas, and I reckon I always will in a way. But I have been happy. You gave me hope again when I was sure I had lost everything." Wade took a good deep breath and pulled a small box out of his pocket. What was inside had cost him a whole week's wages, but it felt right, like something he just had to do. "Rebecca Garrett, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? I want to build a real life with you. I want to raise James as my own son if you will have me. And maybe we could have more children, if that is something you would want. I want to wake up with you beside me every morning and go to sleep next to you every night for the rest of my days." Rebecca was crying by now, but she was smiling too, and her whole face just lit up. "Yes," she said, without even a pause. "Yes, Wade, I will marry you." Wade opened the little box, showing a simple gold band, with a small piece of turquoise set in it. It was from around here and was not fancy, but it was beautiful all the same. He gently slid it onto Rebecca's finger, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him with so much feeling it set his head to spinning and his heart to pounding. They got married a month later in a quiet ceremony at the little church that served skidoo and all the mining camps nearby. Martha stood up as their witness, along with a handful of other friends they had made in town. Rebecca wore a new dress she had sewn herself, a pale blue cotton that made her green eyes shine. And Wade was in his best clothes, all cleaned and pressed. James, who was 5 months old now, was held by Martha during the service, but he seemed to know something special was going on, his big eyes watching everything with a serious look. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Wade kissed Rebecca with all the love and promise he felt in his heart, and their little group of friends clapped. It was not anything fancy, no big party, but it was perfect, just as perfect, in its simple, honest way. They moved into the cottage together that night, a real family at last. Wade had not lived with another soul since his folks passed away, and getting used to it was both easier and harder than he had figured. It was easier because being with Rebecca just felt right, like it was what he was always meant to do. It was harder because he had to learn how to share his space and make decisions with someone else, to think about her needs and wants right alongside his own. But they figured it all out together, learning the little ways they each moved through the day and building a life from the very beginning. Wade kept running supplies, but he started taking shorter trips and coming home more often, not wanting to be gone from his new family for too long. Rebecca started doing some sewing and mending for folks to bring in a little extra money, and they put away every penny they could, making plans for a future that looked brighter every single day. James called Wade Papa for the first time when he was almost a year old, and Wade felt his eyes sting with tears when he heard it. He never would have guessed he could feel such a powerful love for a child that was not his own flesh and blood. But James was his son in every single way that truly mattered, and Wade would have fought any man who dared to say otherwise. One night in early 1886, as they were lying in bed together, Rebecca turned to Wade, looking a little nervous. "I need to tell you something." Wade's heart gave a little jump, and his mind started racing with all sorts of worries. "What is it? Is everything all right?" "No, nothing is wrong," Rebecca said right away. "At least I do not think so. Wade, I am pregnant." Wade just stared at her for a second, letting the words sink in. Then a huge, genuine smile spread clear across his face. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be," Rebecca said. "I have been feeling just like I did with James, and I am late. And Martha says all the signs are pointing to it." Wade pulled her into a hug, holding her as close as he could, his heart feeling so full he thought it might just burst. "That is wonderful news. That is the best news I have ever heard in my life." "You are not worried?" Rebecca asked, her voice a little muffled against his chest. "About the cost? About how we are going to manage with 2 children?" "We will manage the same way we have managed everything else," Wade said, with certainty. "Together. We will make it work, because that is what we do." Rebecca relaxed in his arms, and Wade just held her for the rest of the night, his mind already jumping ahead to what was coming. Another child, a little brother or sister for James. Another life they would bring into this world and raise up together. The thought was both terrifying and exciting, but Wade realized he was not scared. He had Rebecca, and he had James, and soon their little family would be growing. It was more than he had ever allowed himself to hope for, more than he ever thought was possible for a man like him, who had just been drifting through life with no real purpose. The pregnancy went along smoothly, and Rebecca just glowed with health and happiness. James, a little toddler now, seemed to know something was changing, and he got even more cuddly and affectionate with both Wade and Rebecca. Wade added on to the cottage, building another small room that would be a nursery, working on it in the evenings by lamplight after he got back from his supply runs. The baby arrived in November of 1886. It was another tough birth, but it was nothing like the sheer terror of that day out on the desert trail. This time, Rebecca was in their own bed with Wade right beside her, and Martha there to help, her experienced hands guiding them through it all. When their daughter came into the world with a healthy cry, Wade felt that same sense of wonder he had felt when he held James for the very first time, that feeling like he was watching a miracle unfold right there. They named her Sarah, and she had Wade's dark hair and Rebecca's green eyes. James, who was 18 months old by then, was just fascinated by his new baby sister, always wanting to touch her gently and bring her his little toys. Wade would just look at his family with a feeling of peace so deep it almost hurt. This life, the one he had built from scratch, was now so full and rich he could hardly believe it was real. But it was real, as solid and true as the ground beneath his feet. And Wade woke up thankful for it every single morning. He had been given a second chance on the day he heard Rebecca's scream cutting through the quiet of the desert. And he sure had not let it go to waste. He had made the choice to step up, to help, to care, and to love. And that choice had changed his whole world. The years went by, and each one brought its own share of troubles and joys. Wade saved up enough money to buy a little plot of land just outside Skidoo, and he built a proper house on it, a solid, roomy place with enough space for their growing family. They added a son, William, in 1888, and then another daughter, Clara, in 1890. The little cottage behind Martha's boarding house was rented out to somebody else, but they still visited all the time since Martha had become like a doting grandmother to all their children. Wade finally gave up the dangerous job of running supplies through the desert and instead opened up his own freight business right there in Skidoo. He hired other men to make the long runs while he managed everything from town. It was steadier, safer work, and it meant he could be home every single night for supper and be there to tuck his children into bed. James grew up to be a whip-smart, energetic boy who was crazy about horses and wanted to be a cowboy just like his papa. Wade taught him how to ride, how to care for the animals, how to work hard, and how to be kind. He made darn sure James knew about Thomas Garrett, his birth father, telling him the stories Rebecca shared so James would always understand where he came from. But James called Wade Papa, and that was that. And Wade loved him with the same powerful devotion he had for all his children. Sarah was quieter than her brothers, a thoughtful and gentle girl who loved books and learning. William was the wild one, always getting into some kind of mischief, keeping Rebecca and Wade on their toes. Clara was still the baby, too young for her personality to really show, but she was cherished by her older siblings and absolutely doted on by her parents. On warm evenings, Wade would settle onto the porch of their house with Rebecca beside him, watching their children roughhouse in the yard as the sun set over the desert. Sometimes he would think back to that day in July of 1885, to the scream that had pulled him from his path and changed his life for good. He thought about the man he was back then, lonesome and drifting, and the man he had become, surrounded by love and family and a sense of belonging. "What are you thinking about?" Rebecca would ask, reading his face the way she had learned to do over the years. "Just how lucky I am," Wade would answer, taking her hand. "How none of this ever would have happened if I had not been exactly where I was meant to be at that exact moment." "I think about that sometimes, too," Rebecca would say, her voice soft. "About how scared I was. How I was so sure I was going to die all alone on that trail. And then you just appeared, like something out of a storybook, and everything was different. We saved each other," Wade would tell her, and Rebecca would nod, resting her head on his shoulder. It was the honest truth. Wade had saved Rebecca and James that day on the desert trail, catching that baby and getting them somewhere safe. But Rebecca had saved Wade, too. She pulled him out of his loneliness and showed him what a life could be when you let yourself love and connect with people. They had built a beautiful life together, something that neither one of them could have ever made alone. The years just kept on rolling by, and their children grew up. James became a fine young man, and he eventually took over parts of Wade's freight business. Sarah married a school teacher and moved to a town nearby, but she visited all the time with her own growing family. William, to everyone's surprise, finally settled down and became a rancher, with a kind of steadiness nobody ever expected from the wild child he had been. Clara, the baby of the family, became a nurse and gave her life to helping other folks. Her gentle spirit found the perfect home in the work she chose. Wade and Rebecca grew old together, their hair turning to silver, their faces marked by time. But they were still the most beautiful people in the world to each other. They sat on that same porch, now in a house that had held decades of life and love, and they watched their grandkids play in the very same yard where their own children had played before them. "Do you have any regrets?" Rebecca asked one evening, her hand still fitting right into Wade's after all those years. Wade thought on it for a moment. He really considered her question. Had there been tough times? Yes, there were times of struggle and worry and being plain scared. Of course. But regrets? "No," he said finally. "Not a single one. Everything I have, everything we made together, it all started on the day I found you. That was the best moment of my whole life, even if neither one of us knew it at the time." Rebecca smiled, the same smile that had captured Wade's heart from the very beginning. "Mine too. You gave me hope when I did not have any left. You gave James a father and me a partner, and from that, we created this wonderful life. I would not change one single thing." They sat there together as the stars started to pop out overhead, the desert night turning cool and clear around them. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family, their grown children and their families, all gathering for dinner like they did every Sunday. The laughter and chatter, the clinking of plates, and the sound of grandchildren running around, the warm lamplight spilling out from the windows. Wade Emerson had spent years believing he was just meant to be alone, that things like connection and family were not in the cards for him. But on a July day in 1885, a woman's scream had shattered that belief and swung open a door to a future he never could have dreamed of. He had caught a newborn baby on a desert trail, and in that moment he had caught his entire future. He held it in his shaky hands and flat out refused to let go. Rebecca Garrett had been absolutely certain she was going to die alone, that her baby boy would never draw his first breath, that her story would just end in tragedy and heartbreak. But a cowboy showed up when she needed him the most, helped her do the impossible, and then he stayed. He did not just stay for a day or a week, but for a lifetime, building something real and precious from what could have been just a passing moment. They had found one another in the worst situation you could imagine, had fallen in love slow and careful-like, and had created a family that would stretch on for generations. Their love story had started with terror and pain, but it had turned into something beautiful and strong, a real testament to the power of choosing to care, to help, and to stay. As the night got deeper and the family gathered inside for their meal, Wade and Rebecca finally stood up, their hands still joined just as they had been for over 30 years. They walked inside together, into the warmth and the light and the love that they had made. And Wade sent up a quiet prayer, thanking God for the day his path had crossed Rebecca's on that lonesome desert trail. Their story could have ended so many other ways, but it did not. Instead, it became a story of survival and bravery, of a love that came out of nowhere, and of a chosen family, of two people who found each other when they needed it most and built something incredible from that one-chance meeting. It was a story they would tell their grandkids, and their grandkids would tell their own kids after them. It was a legacy of love that started with a scream in the desert and a cowboy who made the choice to answer. The desert had been a cruel place that day in 1885, brutal and harsh, and it seemed like it was made to destroy anything fragile. But it had also been the backdrop for a miracle, the place where two lost souls found each other and learned that together they could get through anything. The same sun that beat down so hard on the rocks and sand had also watched the birth of a new life and the start of a love story that would last a lifetime. Years later, when Wade was an old man in his 70s, he would sometimes ride out to that very spot on the trail, the place where he had found Rebecca. There was no marker, nothing to distinguish it from all the other miles of desert around it. But he always knew exactly where it was. He would just stand there, his old buckskin horse long gone and replaced by younger ones. But his love for the quiet of the desert had never changed, and he would remember. He would remember the sound of her scream, the fear in her eyes, the weight of baby James in his hands as he came into the world. He would remember that long journey back to Skidoo with Rebecca swaying in the saddle. Both of them were worn out clear down to the bone but refused to quit. He would remember the first time she ever smiled at him, the first time he held her hand, the first time he told her that he loved her. And he would remember the life they had built together, one brick at a time, one day at a time, turning what could have been a terrible tragedy into a triumph. James, now a middle-aged man with his own kids, was running the freight business with skill and care. Sarah, William, and Clara were all grown and successful and happy, and all of them carried inside them the legacy of parents who had loved them something fierce and raised them right. On one of those rides, Rebecca went with him, riding side saddle despite her age, her gray hair tucked under a bonnet, but those green eyes of hers were still bright as ever. They stood together at that spot, and Wade put his arm around her waist. "Hard to believe it all started right here," he said quietly. "Is it?" Rebecca asked, looking up at him with a little smile. "I think if I had to pick a place for my whole life to change forever, the desert makes sense. Nothing out here is gentle or easy. To survive, you need strength and grit and the will to fight. We both had that, Wade. We still do." Wade kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar smell of her hair. "I love you, Rebecca Emerson. I have loved you since the day I found you right here, even if I did not have the sense to know it yet." "I love you too," Rebecca said, leaning against him. "Thank you for stopping when you heard me scream. Thank you for not just riding on by." "I never could have ridden away," Wade said. "Not from you, not from the life that we were meant to build together." They stood there for a while longer, two old folks surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Mojave Desert, the very place that had nearly been the end of them, but instead had brought them together. Then they got back on their horses and rode home side by side, back to the house full of memories and the family they had made, back to the life that had started with a scream and a stranger's kindness, and had grown into something neither of them could have ever dreamed of, but that both of them cherished more than anything. The sun set behind them as they rode, painting the desert in shades of gold and rich crimson, and Wade got to thinking on the funny detours a life can make. He thought about how a routine trip to deliver goods turned into the single most important ride of his whole life. He thought how pulling up the reins to help a stranger could plant the seeds for a lifetime of joy. And he thought about how love could take root in the driest, toughest soil and grow into something that could survive any flood or drought. When they finally pulled up to the homestead, their kids were there, along with a whole passel of grandkids and even a few great-grandkids. The littlest ones were too young to grasp it all, but they were already a part of the family story Wade and Rebecca had written. A big party was underway, a gathering to celebrate 40 years of being married. Though Wade sure did not need a party to recall the day or the words they shared in that little church back in Skidoo. As the evening settled in and the family drew close, one of the grandkids asked Wade to tell the story one more time, the one they all knew by heart but loved to hear anyway. Wade glanced over at Rebecca, and she gave him a warm, knowing smile. And so he started his tale. It was back in July of 1885, he said, his voice still steady and clear for his age. I was heading north across the desert, hauling supplies out to a mining camp, when I heard a sound that turned my whole world upside down. The family quieted down to listen, with the children finding spots on the floor and the grown-ups leaning back in their chairs. Wade told them about discovering Rebecca all by herself on that trail, about being the first to hold little James when he entered the world, and about that long, hard journey to get them safely back to Skidoo. He spoke about how their love grew steady and quiet, and about the life they carved out of the wilderness together. He told them about making the choice every single morning to stand their ground, to fight for each other, and to love, especially when times were lean. When he got to the end, the room was quiet for a heartbeat, and then a single person began to clap. Before long, the whole room was applauding, and Wade felt a familiar prickle behind his eyes. He understood then that this was his real legacy. It was not the trading post he had built or the sturdy house he had raised. It was this family, all these wonderful people who were in the world simply because he had decided to listen when a woman cried out for help in the middle of nowhere. Rebecca moved to his side, and their children encircled them, a living, breathing monument to what love and pure grit can accomplish. James, now a man of 40 with streaks of silver in his dark hair, gently placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Thank you, Papa," he said, his voice low and full of feeling, "for saving my mother, for choosing us, and for being the finest father a man could ever hope for." Wade wrapped his arms around him in a tight hug. This son who'd been born right into his own hands, this boy he had raised and cherished just as much as any of his other children. "Thank you for letting me be your pa," Wade replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It has been the greatest privilege of my life." The celebration went on deep into the night, but one by one, folks either headed home or found a spare bed inside the big house. Wade and Rebecca went to their own bedroom, the very same room they had shared for decades, and they got ready for sleep with the easy, comfortable rhythm that comes from a whole life lived side by side. 40 years, Rebecca said as she sat at her vanity, brushing out her long, silvery hair. Sometimes it feels like only yesterday, and other times it feels like a whole eternity. A bit of both, Wade said in agreement as he slipped into his nightshirt. It has surely been both. They got into bed, and Rebecca settled into the crook of Wade's arm, just as she had done for 40 years straight. His arm came around her without a thought, holding her near, and they rested together in a peaceful silence for a good while. "Do you think we would have been happy?" Rebecca asked out of the blue. "If our paths had never crossed, If some other fella had found me that day, or if nobody had, and somehow James and I had made it through on our own. Wade took her question to heart and thought on it for a moment. "I reckon you would have found a way to be happy," he said at last. "You have got the strength to build a good life no matter what comes. But me, I do not think I would have been. I believe I would have just kept on drifting, staying closed off from the world, until one day I was nothing but a bitter old coyote with no one to call my own and nothing to show for all my time on this earth." "I am mighty glad it did not end up that way," Rebecca whispered. "Me too," Wade said, and he leaned over to kiss her forehead. "Me too." They drifted off to sleep just like that, held tight in each other's arms. And if they had any dreams, they were dreams of dusty trails and fresh starts, of cries that were answered and babies that were caught, of two lives woven together and a love that never gave up. Wade Emerson lived to be a ripe old 79 years old, and Rebecca lived to see 77. They were laid to rest next to each other in the Skidoo Cemetery, under one headstone that said it all, together forever. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren all came for the funerals, to mourn the two people they had lost, but also to honor the amazing lives they had led. James, the baby born out there on that desert trail, gave the final words for both his parents. He spoke through his tears about their courage, their deep love, and their solid, unwavering devotion to their family. He told their story one last time, the story of the cowboy and the woman giving birth alone in the wild, about how they rescued each other and built something truly beautiful out of a terrible situation. The legacy of Wade and Rebecca Emerson carried on through their family, through the businesses they started, and through all the people whose lives they had made better. But more than anything, their legacy was the story itself. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most pivotal moments in our lives happen when we make the choice to stop what we are doing, to lend a hand, and to care for a person we have never even met. When you boiled it all down, everything good that happened came from that one decision Wade made on a hot July day back in 1885, the moment he heard a scream carried on the desert wind. He could have just kept on riding. He could have told himself it was not his concern, that he had a schedule to keep and places to be. But he did not do that. He stopped. He helped. And by doing that, he found a whole world of happiness he never even knew he was searching for. Their story became a piece of the history of Skidoo and all the desert country around it. It was told and retold so many times that it started to sound like a tall tale. But at the heart of it all, there was a simple truth, one that folks would remember and pass down to their own kids. It was a testament to the power of a kind heart and the incredible ways that lives can cross paths and be changed for the better in a single instant of choice. That stretch of desert trail where Rebecca brought James into the world was eventually reclaimed by time and the endless shifting sands. Skidoo itself slowly faded away once the gold veins ran dry and the people moved on looking for new chances. But the story lived on, carried in the hearts of those who remembered. It was like a beacon of hope, reminding anyone who heard it that miracles can truly happen in the most unexpected places. It showed that love can take root and blossom even in the harshest desert, so long as you are brave enough to reach out and take a chance on it.